The one that I want to start off with, so you won't think it was like a bait and switch, because we advertised this as a better deal town hall. So I thought I would at least start off with that. And this work kind of grew out of the last 4 or 5 months. A group of us began to put together an economic agenda for the Democratic caucus in the House. Back in January, I was elected by my colleagues to be one of the co-chairs of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. That was a position that was previously held by a gentleman named Steve Israel, a congressman from New York. But the Democratic leader decided to make it 3 co-chairs because there was a lot more work to do. And the responsibilities of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee is to develop the Democratic agenda for the Congress that we're in, and to help develop a long-term message for Democrats for us to take back the House in 2018. And so what we learned in that process, we did a lot of listening, not only with my constituents here in Rhode Island, but my co-chairs are Hakeem Jeffries from New York, Sherry Bustos from Illinois, and me from Rhode Island. So we represent 3 very different districts, very rural, urban. I think Rhode Island has both, and so I think we all brought kind of our own perspectives. But we did a lot of listening, not only with our colleagues, but with people around the country, labor leaders, business leaders, people who ran for Congress and won, people who ran for Congress and lost. We studied a lot of analysis that was done about the election and about a number of focus groups and a lot of polling. And the thing was really clear to me from the beginning of this process was that what was really important to my constituents was to hear a very bold economic agenda that would address the economic anxiety that people have in their lives. And so the end result of this was the culmination of, and at the same time the Senate was doing the same thing, kind of developing their own economic agenda. And then the last 3 weeks we had to kind of merge the two, which is an interesting exercise. But in the end it was this notion of, the kind of tag phrase was a better deal, better wages, better jobs, a better future. Really focus on 3 pillars, 3 economic pillars. One is raising people's incomes and creating 10 million good-paying full-time jobs, and really focusing on efforts to actually increase people's wages, because what we heard from everyone was like, I just can't get by. Wages have remained pretty consistent over the last couple of decades, and people just haven't felt any of this economic recovery. So focus on how do you increase incomes and create good-paying jobs. The second is addressing the costs in people's lives, and that's everything from healthcare to childcare to prescription drugs. What are the things you can do to drive down the cost of things that are presenting real struggles for families? And then the third part of it is about ensuring that people have the skills necessary for the jobs of the 21st century. We heard a lot about people, even if they had a job, they worried, is there going to be one in 3 years? Or if I don't have a job, am I ever going to find one? Do I have the skills necessary for the jobs of the 21st century? So addressing that with major investments in apprenticeships, in job training, in paid job training, things that will get people the skills they need for the jobs that are available in the new economy. So we launched that, and then we're putting out very specific proposals over the next several months about how we attempt to do that. Because one thing that was very clear to me is people just don't want to hear a lot of rhetoric. They actually want to hear, what are you going to specifically do if Democrats take back the House to improve the life of my family? And give me the specific proposals. And so when we launched the Better Deal, Better Wages, Better Jobs for a Better Future, we used we launched a couple of simple ideas. The first one was legislation to allow the government to negotiate discounted prices with pharmaceutical companies for Medicare. This is something, there's a piece of legislation introduced. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of it. One of the big drivers of healthcare is prescription drug prices. We're maybe the only developed country in the world that allows pharmaceutical companies just to set whatever drug prices they want. And we've all seen the examples where they buy another company or they buy a drug and they increase it by 1,000%. We saw it with EpiPen, we saw it with hepatitis C. I mean, it's criminal. But there's no prohibition against it. A lot of countries, they say, what does it cost to produce this drug? What is it worth? What's the value of it? And then they set a price. We don't do that. And as a consequence, we pay the highest prescription prices in the world, and it's a system which is just awful. And so one thing we could do for sure that would help drive down the cost of prescription drugs is allow the federal government to negotiate discounted prices with Medicare. It's like, has anyone here been to Sam's Club? You know, you go to Sam's Club, you buy in bulk, you get a discount. Same idea. And if we could do that, the CBO has estimated that it would save tens of billions of dollars. Not millions, billions, not only for the consumer, but for the taxpayer. So not only for the patients who buy those prescription drugs, but for the taxpayers as well through the Medicare system. So why don't we do it? Because it was written into the law by the big drug companies. They had it written into law, a prohibition that prevents the federal government from negotiating discounted prices. There is no good public policy reason for that. It was simply to enrich big drug companies. And they spend a lot of money on lobbyists and campaign contributions to achieve that result. And so we introduced a bill that gets rid of that prohibition that would produce real savings for consumers of prescription drugs. So that's one example. We also announced a proposal to prevent price gouging by creating an agency within the federal government to really monitor price gouging by drug companies to prevent that from happening, and additional legislation that will bring greater transparency from drug companies about what they're spending, what things cost, etc. So there's more accountability. We also announced at that time a commitment to double the number of apprenticeships, which is really a key to the new economy and making sure people have the skills necessary. And so we're going to try over the next several weeks, each week or each couple of weeks, announce some more specifics. But that's the general kind of economic agenda. It's really focused on those three things. I think when you arrive, you got a handout. There's a lot more material and there's a lot more proposals in that, which I'm happy to talk more about. But I wanted to just give you kind of a general outline that we all think it's really important to stay very focused on a strong economic agenda that we can use and that speaks to the needs of American people all across the country, in conservative places and liberal places, and rural and urban. It's really a strong economic message that I think works all across the country. At the same time, of course, we're going to still fight for all the things that make us Democrats, and I'm happy to talk about all those too, but this was really about an economic agenda, and so it was a pretty narrow focus for our work. That's a better deal. I think, you know, there are a number of people have asked about North Korea, so I thought I'd spend a minute on North Korea. I'd like to talk a little bit about manufacturing, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about campaign finance reform, and then I'll stop there. I think many of the issues we face in this country, or at least in the Congress of the United States, and the difficulty in getting things done, that one of the things that we have to recognize that has contributed to that is the influence of big money in our political system. And frankly, if we don't fix the way we run elections and the way that money influences our political system, it will be hard to do almost anything that we need to do. And the pharmaceutical example was just one example. So we have a package of bills we've put together that come out of a democracy reform task force that I'm a vice chair of, that really are focused on how do we reduce the influence of money in our political system. So the first one is a piece of legislation, a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizens United, so that corporations cannot spend secretly in our elections, which up until that decision, I mean, a very, very corrosive occurrence in our country that has really begun to make our democracy a democracy of the checkbooks of a few rather than the voices of the many. So this is a really important reform. The second is ensuring that, it's called the Disclose Act. I introduced it in the House, Senator Whitehouse introduced it in the Senate. This would require super PACs to disclose the donors to their super PAC and put it in the ad. It turns out most super PACs are almost completely funded by 3 people or less. So if you require them to put the top 3 donors in the ad, you at least will know this is brought to you by Charles and David Koch or whoever else. So you can then decide what weight to give it. Disclosure will help. The third is a citizen-financed public financing of our elections so that we can eliminate as much as possible actual private big money in our elections. And in addition to that, I've introduced the automatic voter registration bill. I think one of the ways that we can amplify the voices of the many in our democracy is encourage more people to participate by voting and removing obstacles So the automatic voter registration law in Rhode Island was the 9th state to adopt it at the state level, which is great, and kudos to Nellie Gorbet and her team. But basically it grows out of this idea that we live in a country where we actually didn't want everyone to vote. In fact, everyone couldn't vote. Only white people could vote, only men could vote, only people who own property could vote. So there was a reason we wanted people to have to register. What this bill says is now we live in a country where we want every U.S. citizen who is qualified to vote, who is eligible to vote. And so instead what it does is it flips that presumption on its head and says, when you turn 18, if you're a citizen of the United States, you are registered to vote as a matter of law. You're then notified and said, congratulations, you're a voter, and if you want, you have 30 days to unregister. Because there's some people who just don't want to register to vote. They have objections to it, but it basically reverses that presumption. The state of Oregon has done this. It's been a huge success. It allowed, at least made eligible 350,000 more people to vote. So that's great. I think my bill has 150 co-sponsors, but it is unlikely to move in the current Congress, but I'm still pressing it. But Rhode Island just passed that law, so I think that's something we should be very proud of. The third thing I want to mention, or fourth thing, is one of my principal pieces of work continues to be the Make It in America agenda, which is really about helping to rebuild and strengthen American manufacturing. I have a number of bills that are part of that agenda. It's about 30 or 40 pieces of legislation, all designed to give American manufacturers a level playing field, a fighting chance. People want to buy stuff made in America. We make the best products in the world, but we put put American manufacturers at such a disadvantage. One simple example of that is that our tax code gives a tax break to companies who ship American jobs overseas. And so we've created incentives for people to ship jobs overseas. I introduced the bill in the House, Senator Whitehouse introduced the bill in the Senate to get rid of those incentives and instead give tax breaks to people who create jobs in America. Seems like a pretty obvious idea, but you will not be surprised to learn that a lot of very powerful, big multinational corporations that manufacture in Vietnam and China and other like that tax provision, and so far they've been successful in keeping it in place. So, but that's a really important issue for me and a really important issue for Rhode Island, so something I'm going to continue to focus on. Last thing I want to mention is college affordability, which is a passion of mine. I hear from lots of young people. I have a nephew who just graduated from PC with enormous student loan debt, who are like looking for jobs, and this is going to be the next big debt crisis in this country, because young people are leaving with almost impossible debt to overcome. It's not only really harmful for them because it's causing this tremendous anxiety, and they have to stay living with their parents, and they can't buy their first car, and they can't get their first apartment, but it's bad for the economy because that's when a lot of new entrants into the job market are making those purchases. It's having a real drag on our economy. I have my own bill. I'm happy to talk about it if people are interested. There are a number of other bills to address this issue. I think it's an urgent priority, should be for our country, because it's a very big issue.